What's going on, everyone? Happy Sunday, and yes, you saw the title of this video correctly. Sabine ban slash Han ban is the topic of conversation since my previous video. So many people are, I guess, sick of seeing these decks at the top, and we're going to dive into that today, as well as more results piling in between yesterday and today, where we have a new most prominent deck from the amount of top 8s that they're receiving, as well as someone that's competing with Sabine. And I might have given it away at the beginning of the video, but we'll dive into that in just a moment. Or you could just, look right here. Big thank you to my patrons over on Patreon, and also I have a TCG player link in the description down below. But first off, the new happenings. First, Han Yellow absolutely crushing it this weekend. Not only was it extremely popular and winning in terms of top 8, but it also managed to pull multiple wins of the entire PQ stage. That is really sweet. We now have a direct competitor towards Sabine in terms of win percentage. Sabine still sits at the top, even with less top 8s, which makes you think, okay, is Sabine a little bit of a better deck? But I don't know if that's necessarily the case. It's hard to decide. Also, we don't know the actual statistics of, again, the entrance of these decks. Han Yellow also beat itself out. As far as I saw through a lot of the planetary qualifiers, a lot of the top 8s were multiple Han Yellows, and Han Yellow was beating Han Yellow, resulting in less Han wins, but more Han top 8s. Not only that, but Anakin had a really awesome weekend. 2 Anakin Blues in the finishing winnings, which is absolutely sweet, and a lot more in the top 8s. And overall, just a lot more data, a lot more random decks. We've got like Boba Blue, new Boba, that is. We've got Chancellor Palpatine Blue, the new Chancellor Palpatine. We've got Luke ECL, Han 2 Blue. We've got Asajj Tarkintown versus just Asajj Red, double red Kylo, Mace Windu Blue. Okay, Yoda Red. Mind you, these two actually took a win. It is absolutely insane. And as I'm talking about this, I know there's a lot of people like, yeah, sure, there's going to be some decks at the bottom. But Han and Sabine are a problem. And I don't necessarily agree. So Boba Fett was certainly a problem. When you look at the meta percentage, when you look at the decks that were actually competing, it was a total of like 41, I believe it was, percent of the meta at the end of set 2 with the planetary qualifiers of Boba Fett. And the winnings of those events were also about 40%, almost double, more than double of what we're seeing in terms of top 8 percentage at the most, which is Han Yellow, and just about double what we're seeing in terms of winners of the planetary qualifiers. On top of that, we were not seeing nearly as many random decks actually compete and win the tournament. And that means two things. One, we do have a meta, but that meta isn't so dominant to the point where other meta decks can't regularly compete. It's why we have 19% Han Yellow, 15% Sabine Green, 9% Quinlan Red, 7.5% Django Red, etc. But also why we have a bunch of these random one-ofs actually in the top 8. And not only that, but also a bunch of one-ofs actually winning the planetary qualifiers themselves. This was not happening nearly as much in previous set 2 planetary qualifier meta. If we were to just compare, and I think this is a pretty important thing to do, to Magic the Gathering, one of the most popular, if not the most popular trading card game in terms of tournaments, happenings, and coverage. I was actually watching a recent Magic tournament because it happened, what was it? Was it last weekend? I think it was last weekend, but I've been catching up on that. It was a standard tournament, and we had a massive slew of the meta. And what you'll see here is the meta does have a lot more options, and that's mainly because we have more sets and more strategies to go with. But a lot of these are derivative of themselves, like Gruul Prowess and Gruul Aggro are not necessarily the same deck, but very similar. And if you were to combine those two, you'd have, well, potentially 13% of the meta. The biggest deck, the most popular one in terms of the meta game, is 15.7%, followed up by 10%. So a little bit less than what we're seeing in our game. If we look at Modern, which is a different format, very similar to what we will probably have after rotation comes, 12.5% and 11%. If we look at Pioneer, another format that Magic has, 25% of the meta and 8% of the meta is the following next one. And these honestly could be combined to some degree. Again, very similar color combinations, not necessarily similar strategies, but somewhat similar. Same with this deck over here. In this format, there probably would be a call to ban because this is more than probably 25% of the meta realistically in terms of similar strategies. This is the type of thing where, okay, maybe we need a card banned or maybe we need some sort of action. But in terms of what we're seeing in our meta right now, well, there really isn't anything that's sticking out like a sore thumb, right? Remember, literally yesterday, I spoke about how Sabine was at the top of its game, and that's with the finishing of week 1, right? With all the week 1 results in, we had Sabine at the top. Suddenly, week 2, we have Han Yellow at the top, and Sabine has dropped down in terms of top 8 percentage. Not saying that Sabine is not the best deck or anything like that. You can argue Sabine's best, Han Yellow's best, Quinlan Red's best, Django Red's best, Cad Bane Red's best, etc., etc., etc. But it's fluctuating massively between weeks. And we're only 2 weeks in. So while you may be sick of seeing Sabine there, and I totally respect that because Sabine has been there since day 1 and continues to be like number 1, number 2, or number 3 in terms of best decks in the format between all 3 sets. Han Yellow didn't really exist in set 1, existed in set 2, but not quite as dominant as set 3 here. Quinlan didn't even exist, Django didn't exist, Cad didn't really exist between set 1 and set 2. So yes, a bunch of new stuff, whereas Sabine's kind of like the old guard. But there's no real reason to be considering bannings for any sort of leader, at least in my opinion. And I know some people might disagree, and that's totally fair. Again, there is something to be said about banning for interest of viewership and excitement of competitive play. That is an absolutely valid reason to ban something in terms of FFG's perspective. But I see a lot of people talking about, okay, it's winning too much. It's too big of a problem. Like Sabine is too strong. And at that dynamic, I don't agree. I don't think Sabine is too strong. I think it's literally just a kind of like a deck check. If your deck is able to compete, you need to be able to beat Sabine Green. You need to be able to compete with some aggro decks out there. And Sabine is the best of them. And that is something that you need to consider. And I think that's totally fair. Being able to kind of check yourself against certain archetypes is something that is usually pretty healthy for the meta. And while this format is usually, well, at least pretty aggressive as far as I found. And if you look at the top spots, right, we have Han Yellow, very much a tempo, beat you down type of deck with Disruption, aggro and Sabine, Quinlan Red with early game tempo and beat you down, Django with space strategies, Cad with early value and lots of aggression. Well, yes, it is an aggressive format, but I don't think Sabine is necessarily a problem. On that note, we have a couple of different decks that I want to dive into, some more unique ones. Of course, there's a lot here and a lot ones that we had already previously talked about, but two specifically that I wanted to mention. Mace Windu Blue and Yoda Red actually winning planetary qualifiers. So let's pop over to Mace Windu Blue first. And if you guys checked out my Mace Windu double red deck where we kind of burned the whole world down, I think I titled it. Well, Mace Windu Red I found to be on the weaker side of things. Mace Windu Blue was one that I was a lot more excited about. And it's very similar to kind of what I was running, albeit with a few different changes. This is very much a sort of mid-range, more soft control deck, kind of similar to Anakin Blue, but usually goes a little bit bigger than Anakin Blue because you don't have that amazing finisher. But you're using Mace Windu with a bunch of controlling elements, and because you have this damage, a lot of different events suddenly become really, really strong. Daring Raid is suddenly 2 resources for 3 damage. That can basically kill anything on turn 1. Grenade Strike, 2 resources, 2 damage to one, 1 damage to another. You can deal another one on 3 resources, so 3 damage to something, or 1 damage to something else, or 2 damage to something and 2 damage to another thing. Very, very versatile. Open Fire becomes not just 3 resources 5 damage, or 3 resources 4 damage, but it can become 4 resources 6 damage because of Mace Windu. This allows you to actually take down things like Poe Dameron with open fire plus Mace Windu's action. There's a lot of different things that can happen, and that gives you a lot of controlling elements. Alongside that, we kind of are just playing a standard curve, a little bit of card draw, like Queel, a little bit of late game valuability and tech, a little bit of restoring, Steela. This one's the one that I had not run in my deck. I am not as big of a fan of it, but I think it's interesting to see. If you just look through, there's a couple of tactics in the deck. I should say a lot more than a couple. Couple is the wrong word. There's quite a few tactics in the deck. Basically, all of your removal options are tactics. So Daring Ray, Grenade Strike, Open Fire, Fell the Dragon, Pillage, etc., etc., etc. All tactics, which are really, really strong. So you can basically find exactly what you're looking for. I think this is really, really interesting. I am interested in trying this out because in my Mace Windu Blue, as I said, I had pretty good results with. I was not running that, but basically everything else is the standard that I would expect you to be running. Crate Dragon and Luke Skywalker as finishers. Redemption is a little bit of restoring HP. And this is a pretty awesome deck. It's a pretty sweet one, and it actually wins the whole planetary qualifier. I believe in Germany was this one. So absolutely sweet stuff there. But then we also had Yoda Red, which is a very different strategy than your Mace Windu Blue. Mace Windu Blue is by far a more controlling, more mid-rangey deck. Yoda Red, on the other hand, has a very, very large amount of units to curve out on. We still get to play Ketsus and Queels and Sabines and all that good stuff, and A-Wings, so you can actually beat down your opponents. But then if you do end up in the mid to late game, yes, you have your Poes, yes, you have your Obi-Wans, you got your Lukes and Crate Dragons, which is awesome. But then Yoda comes down, right? And he basically resets the board, kills something almost every single time, and is a 4/9 and has Restore 2 to allow you to really close out the game. Mix that with a couple of different really, really awesome synergies, like You're My Only Hope, and this deck can be really scary. You're My Only Hope is basically what makes Yoda truly a terrifying prospect, alongside, now there are 2 of them if you're playing Yoda Yellow, but I think You're My Only Hope is what makes this deck have that dynamic where you can just win games, right? You're sitting there, you're playing Yoda, you're on your 3 resource turn, and you're sitting there and you're like, okay, or a 5 resource turn, and you have your K2SO out. You go in and you trade with a unit. Great, you deal 3 damage to them. You play, or you use your Yoda action, put something like Luke Skywalker on top of the deck, or Mace Windu on top of the deck. You play your My Only Hope, play your Luke Skywalker or Mace Windu for essentially 5 resources, kill something of theirs, or in Mace Windu's case, just ambush something of theirs and then hopefully kill it, ready up and hit their base. Or in Luke's case, just kill something and then be left with a 6/7 with Restore 3. It's insane. It's absolutely insane. And mind you, you can do this at any turn of the game. If you have 7 resources, you can put Crate Dragon on top of your deck and then play Crate Dragon for 7 resources. Like, that is absolutely absurd. So really, really cool dynamic there. And it does have a little bit of a force synergy, but it's a very expensive deck, as you can see here. I love seeing this type of stuff. But again, this is a result of the top decks, while popular, not being as dominant as you'd expect. If they were as dominant as you expect, you would not be seeing these random winners. This, it never happens in Magic. You never really see decks that are kind of just out there being random, taking down massive tournaments. The closest to it that we had in Magic was, there was a couple of, about, I want to say 7-8 months ago, there was a tournament where a team actually pulled together and basically created a new deck and then brought that, and that was extremely dominant. But it wasn't like this one of, Yoda Red that one person decided to bring, or maybe a couple people drafted together or thought of together and came in and won the whole thing. That just doesn't really happen in other games. So the fact that it's even happening at all maybe as a result of just not having as large of a tournament, totally potentially true, or the popularity of some of these decks isn't as big as you might think, or it's the fact that we don't have Boba and we don't have an oppressive leader in the game right now. And I think that is true. I think it could be a combination of all 3, but I think the fact is we are not seeing a leader nearly as dominant as Boba Fett. And I don't think any of the decks, any of the lists, any of the leaders here that we're seeing is worth a ban because of an oppressive nature regarding the deck. Maybe because of interest of competitive enjoyment, you could ban one of these because Sabine Green's not interesting to watch, which Magic has done in the past, for example. But that's up to really subjective opinion. And I think Sabine Green isn't necessarily bad to watch anyways. But that's just my opinion. Let me know what you think in the comment section down below. Thanks for watching, everyone. And I'll see you all for a video tomorrow.